Today's webinar, Battle LinkedIn Law Firms vs. Consulting Firms, will be presented by Alex Ziegler. Alex is a strategist at One North, working with complex, relationship-based organizations to understand their business goals and translate them into positive user experiences. She brings her unique combination of expertise in both business and design to serve as a bridge between these two areas. With that, I'll turn it over to our speaker.
Thanks, Kayla. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining the webinar today, Battle LinkedIn Law Firms versus Consulting Firms. I'm going to be sharing some really interesting data today about how some of the top law firms and consulting firms fare on LinkedIn. And even more importantly, I'm going to be talking about ways that your company can be engaging a bigger audience as well. But before I jump into all of that, I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Alex Ziegler, and as Kayla said, I'm a strategist at One North. And one fun fact about me is that I actually used to be a consultant, but I promise that I'm not going to pick sides today in this battle. I also recently checked and saw that I actually have 622 connections on LinkedIn. And at first I was really proud of myself, and then I realized that I'm actually still way behind my father-in-law, who is a corporate counsel and a power networker. So I still have a ways to go with that. And finally, I actually found my way to One North through a LinkedIn job posting. So needless to say, I'm really thankful for LinkedIn, and I'm also really excited to be presenting about it today. I want to start off by talking about why LinkedIn matters. And this may not be so surprising to a lot of you on the call today, but it was actually dubbed the social network preferred by executives by Forbes, Business News Daily, and Modern Survey. 88% of executives said that they use LinkedIn often, and 73% said that LinkedIn is their preferred social network. And the fact that a lot of people say that they're using LinkedIn and that they say that they really like using LinkedIn is actually supported by the total number of users on LinkedIn. And if you look at this graph, it's really quite astonishing that in 2004, there were 1.6 million users, and now 10 years later, we're at 332 million users on LinkedIn. So needless to say, it's definitely growing in importance over time, and it's why it's very important for us to be focusing on it. And another interesting point is that LinkedIn is not just in the US, and in fact, it's really growing globally. In Q3 of 2014, this year, 75% of new users came outside of the US. So it's just important to know how big this network really is. And then the final reason why we think LinkedIn is really important is that it applies to every stage of your client relationships. A lot of you may have already seen this relationship cycle. We talk about it a lot here at One North. And just to give you some examples of how we think LinkedIn applies to all these different touch points, if someone sees a relevant post on LinkedIn, that helps to generate their awareness. Also through the personal connections that you make on LinkedIn, that can help to establish trust and advocacy. And then also when you see others share and recommend content, that's really showing loyalty and influence as well. So we could have looked at Twitter or Facebook for this assessment, but we really chose LinkedIn because we think it's unique in how it applies to all the different touch points of your client relationship. And now that I've talked about why LinkedIn matters, I want to spend some time talking about why we at One North were curious about it and what we wanted to investigate. So the main question that we wanted to answer is, what are the top law firms and consulting firms doing on LinkedIn to build relationships? And how did we do this? We chose to look at the top 10 law firms as well as the Vault top 10 consulting firms and actually take a peek and to see what they're doing on LinkedIn and assess what their presence is. So what did we want to learn through this? It was really three different things. We first wanted to know, how are companies using LinkedIn? And we chose to look at 4 different dimensions. We looked at company profile, company posts, groups, and leadership profiles. And then secondly, we were interested in how does all of this LinkedIn activity actually impact audience engagement, which we chose to assess by looking at the number of followers. And I'll talk more about that later. And then finally, maybe most interestingly, is we wanted to know which of these dimensions actually makes the biggest impact in terms of how many followers companies can attain on LinkedIn. So I want all of you to actually think about this in your head. If you had to pick one of these 4 dimensions, which one would you guess is going to have the most impact on number of followers? And I'm going to give the answer at the end, and you can see whether or not you're right. And then finally, you may be wondering how we approach this. So I talked about the different firms that we assessed, but also I wanted to point out that we actually created our own scoring rubric across all these different dimensions. So we had 0 being least robust and 5 being most robust. And what this allowed us to do was make this assessment a bit more quantitative, and then also it allowed us to have really neat heat maps that actually help you see what some of the differences are in a very visual format, which I'm going to show you in a bit. So going ahead here, I'm actually going to walk through each of these 4 dimensions that I had just presented to you and show you how the firms fared across each of these. So the first dimension is company profile. And here what we wanted to know is, does each company use the features that are available to them for their main company page? And that includes both the main company profile as well as a careers page. And here I have listed some of the different features that are currently available to different companies through LinkedIn for this particular page. And what we did was we gave a 0 to companies that weren't using any of these features versus a higher score if they were using 1 or more of these features, and a score of 5 if they actually used all of them. And I'm sure all of you have seen a company page before on LinkedIn, at least I hope you have. This is an example of Accenture's. They have, as you can see, the home page and then also the careers page. And here's an example of an auxiliary page, which we included as one of the features. Accenture has a Accenture digital page as well as their main company page. And then here's a view of their careers page, which is pretty robust. You can see they have video, description, and all of that. So who wins this battle? We found actually that when it comes to the main company page, consulting firms were the winner, but overall there was not that much difference. Both law firms and consulting firms do pretty well in terms of using the features for their main company page. Where we saw the bigger difference was actually the careers page. Consulting firms utilize career page features quite a bit more than law firms, and you're going to see that in the data. So here's the first example of that heat map that I was talking to you about. Here you see law firms, and you see that overall they're not doing too badly in terms of their using features for the main company page, but for the careers page, they're lagging a bit behind. You see a lot more blue in this heat map. Versus this is consulting firms, and you can see that overall they tend to do better in terms of utilizing the features on both these pages, with a few exceptions toward the bottom. And here's this high-level comparison. So you can see they're pretty even, except for that careers page that seems to be different between them. So what were some of our observations and questions about this data? One thing we noticed is that many law firms have the bare minimum when it comes to their careers page. They're not using all the features that are available to them. So we asked, why is this? One hypothesis we have is that LinkedIn does charge for the use of these features, so we think that could potentially be a barrier. But we do think that there is such a big potential benefit to having a really robust careers page, and that's because recruits are coming to that page, which is a great value in itself, but we also think that other people who happen to be coming to the company page, exploring the company, they may be interested to see a bit about the firm's culture and hear some people speak in a video. So we do think there's a lot of benefit to that. Okay, moving on now to the next dimension. This was company posts. And here what we wanted to know is, does each company post updates? And if so, how frequently do they post? So we had a score for they don't post at all, which would be 0. We also considered once a year, once a month, once a week, a few times a week. The most robust was that they post at least once a day. The other thing that we looked at, which we didn't include in our numeric scoring, but we still thought would be interesting to explore, was what type of posts are these firms making? Is it firm news related? Is it largely external news, or is it thought leadership? And I'm going to walk you through some examples of each of these 3. And I'm going to use DLA Piper as an example because they actually post a nice mixture of all these three different types, so they're good to point out. So in terms of firm news, this is a post that DLA Piper made announcing that 2 of its attorneys have received the Leadership in Law Award. And this linked to a press release on the DLA Piper site, and it helps definitely to credentialize the firm, but it doesn't necessarily provide a lot of information that audiences can use. So we do think that it does have some value to post it onto their LinkedIn page, but we do think that it's really important to mix these types of posts in with other types as well. Here's an example of an external news post. They posted a link to an external news source, which is the Recorder, and this showcases the firm's perspective on something that's happening in the news. So it both credentializes DLA Piper, and it also offers some useful information that people can use and take away. And then finally, this is a post that they made that we are categorizing as thought leadership. And this links to a publication on the DLA Piper site, and it includes, as you can see, an interesting infographic. It demonstrates knowledge of the retail industry, and it guides users to explore more information on the website. So this we consider to be one of the most valuable types of posts that you can make on LinkedIn, because especially if you can imagine someone who's coming here, they're from the retail industry, this is something really relevant to them that they can use, and it's also guiding them to learn more about DLA Piper on their website. So definitely a great example of what type of content you can post on LinkedIn. So now I want to talk about the results. So who wins this battle of posting on LinkedIn? We actually found a tie here. We saw that law firms and consulting firms are doing a really good job of posting on a very frequent basis. But when we looked at the types of posts that they're making, we are calling consulting firms the winner here, and that's because they do tend to post a lot more thought leadership content, while law firms often tend to post quite a bit more firm news. And here's this heat map for you to see. So you can see that in terms of frequency of posting, everyone is doing a pretty good job, and it's actually quite consistent. There's a lot of 4s here. They're posting on a regular basis. And consulting is pretty much the same. Once again, you see a lot of 4s, a bit more 5s, but overall they're doing very well. And there's that visual comparison. But now when you look at the types of posts, we created just this chart here. You can see that law firms do tend to also post thought leadership and external news, but there's a lot more emphasis on firm news. And for consulting, thought leadership definitely wins out in terms of what is posted most frequently. So some observations here were that law firms are not posting as much thought leadership content as consulting firms, and we wondered why this is. And our hypothesis here is that oftentimes it's likely easier to post firm news content. We do think that law firms actually have a lot of the great thought leadership content like consulting firms do, but they may not be leveraging it the way that they could be, and that's because it does require a bit more effort to curate and select blog posts, develop infographics to draw interest. But we think that there is a lot of value there, and that it'd be great if we saw that more across LinkedIn pages for law firms. Okay, and now I'm going to talk through the third dimension, which is groups. So here we wanted to know, does each company have groups? And if they do, how many do they have? And we came up with a scale here based on how many groups we saw across the board, and we gave a score of 5 if there was 16 or more groups, and 0 if there were no groups. I want to actually show you some examples of group types, because we did see some interesting patterns with the types of groups that firms were creating. And I'm going to use Bain as the example here, because they have quite a few groups. This one is location-based, so this is Bain & Company in Italy. This group is alumni or expertise-focused, so Bain alums in financial services. And the third type that we saw were program-focused. So this is Bain's Diversity Pre-MBA program. And something to point out is that quite frequently we saw that these groups were private and that they were for people more internal to Bain. So who wins this battle? We actually saw that by far consulting firms have quite a few more groups than law firms. And you can definitely see that in our heat map here. In terms of the scoring, you can see there's a lot of blue on this site, and it's pretty consistent that a lot of these firms just aren't really creating a lot of groups. And it's quite different when you look at the consulting side, but it is good to note that it's not all the same. They're not all using a lot of groups. There is some differentiation here, so that's interesting to notice. And there's that visual comparison. This is one of the biggest differences that we saw. So some of our observations here were that law firms don't utilize groups as much, and we wondered why that is. We think that there may be some regulatory reasons why law firms are more hesitant to use groups. That's something that we'd like to investigate more. But in general, what we found at least is that we think that there's a big opportunity to have alumni groups. That's where we saw a lot of value. And that's because alumni, past employees, can definitely become future clients, and they can also refer people as well. So it makes sense to network with these people, and having groups allows them to do that. Okay, and now I'm going to move on to our last dimension, which was leadership profiles. Here we wanted to know, does each leader have a robust profile? So we actually looked up all the leadership names for all the firms that we were looking at, and we checked out each of their profiles. So we were snooping on them a bit, and we looked to see how many connections do they have on LinkedIn? Are they using all the different profile features that they have available to them? And also, are they posting publications? That's a relatively new feature on LinkedIn. You can actually post thought leadership content and publications onto your profile. So we assessed all these things and gave these different scores. And just some examples, I think all of you should be aware of a lot of these, but this is how we looked to see how many connections people had. These are the different types of profile components. We were just checking to see whether or not they were filled out. And we were looking to see if publications were added to these leadership profiles. And one thing to actually call out is that we couldn't consistently identify leaders for all of the firms. And a good example is for PwC. If you go to their website, we actually saw a list of 27 different leaders identified on their website, versus some, we just couldn't even find the names of all the leaders to look up. So A.T. Kearney and Oliver Wyman, we only had one leader that we searched on LinkedIn. And that's just important to note because we do think that it skewed some of our results a bit, but we couldn't really find a way around that. And it was an interesting finding in itself to know that we simply couldn't even find those names. Okay, so who won this battle? Very interesting, actually, is that both law firms and consulting firms are pretty weak when it comes to their leadership profiles. We were kind of disappointed a bit. We couldn't find some of them even. But in terms of looking at just the top profile by firm, we actually found that consulting firms beat out law firms in this regard, that a lot of their top profiles were far more robust than the law firms, and you'll see that in a minute. So here's that heat map if you look at the leadership team overall, and we're actually showing the difference between number of connections versus profile features versus whether or not they're posting publications to their profile. So you can definitely see overall lots of darker colors because they're not doing all that great, but publications stands out as really not really using it at all, which makes sense because it's a newer feature, but we thought that was a bit of a missed opportunity there. And then if you look at consulting firms, you can see they are doing a bit better, but I pointed out those two examples of A.T. Kearney and Oliver Wyman. We just found one leader profile, so they kind of got an unfair advantage there. But overall, not doing that great in terms of their leadership profiles. And here you can see a higher level heat map. And you can see at the top, we looked at all the leaders and all of their profiles versus if you just take the top individual from each firm, and you can see that consulting is definitely doing better. There's a lot more red in their visual. But across all of them, you'll see there is that blue column all the way on the right, and that's because not many are currently posting publications to their profile. So some observations here. We noticed that the lowest utilized feature was publications, which we think is a missed opportunity. Another thing to point out is that we looked just at leadership profiles, and that's because this effort was highly manual. We were going to each leader page and taking a look at their profile, but it would be really interesting in the future to look at all employees of a firm because, of course, their presence could be important as well. And then finally, we saw that firms are doing poorly in this area overall, so we couldn't help but wonder if this dimension even really matters on LinkedIn. And that's something that we'll have to just find out when we get to the end here. Okay, so now that I've talked to each of the dimensions, I want to get to the juicy part, which is what is the impact of all of this LinkedIn activity? Does it actually lead to increased engagement? And that brings me back to this initial slide where I was showing you what are the different questions that we were looking to answer. So before we can answer the question, how does this impact audience engagement, we have to first decide how exactly we're going to measure engagement on LinkedIn. And the ideal way for us to measure engagement would have been if we can get access to each of these analytics pages on each company page. And this is an example of One North's analytics. But unfortunately, we couldn't do that. We couldn't go to each company page and get some of this amazing rich data that's available to companies. We had to go about it a different way, something that's publicly accessible. And that's why we turn to the number of followers. We do think that how many followers a company has on LinkedIn is a good sign of engagement, and that's because when someone chooses to follow a company, it means that they're subscribing to updates to receive in their feed. And another thing to point out is that we didn't want to just take the number of followers. We wanted to normalize this a bit so that we can compare better. And that's because, as you can imagine, a really large firm is going to have a much larger network, both current employees, alumni, et cetera. And those people tend to like to follow their own company that they're associated with. So given that, we chose to look at the follower to employee ratio as the main measure to kind of even the playing field here. And if you look only at this follower to employee ratio, we've actually mapped out how all the firms would land here and compare them. And you can see in red is the consulting firms and in blue is the law firms. So right away you can see that consulting firms are doing quite a bit better in terms of how many followers they're able to get on LinkedIn. And what was really interesting to us is actually how for consulting there's quite a bit variation, while for law firms it's actually pretty consistent in terms of how many followers that they have. So now the question that we wanted to answer was, how does this ranking of how companies stack up in terms of how many followers they have, how does that match up to the ranking of how they're doing on LinkedIn according to the score that we assign them based on how robust we saw their presence to be? And what we found is that there is somewhat of a correlation here. And you can see that when you look at McKinsey, they received they were in second place in terms of the LinkedIn score that we gave them. But in terms of the follower ranking, they were also ranked #1, very highly. So that aligned pretty well. But I did want to point out cases where it didn't align as well, and those are highlighted in red. A.T. Kearney is an example. So, and as I mentioned, we only identified one leader for them, so that might have skewed a bit the fact that they received the #1 LinkedIn ranking and had a lower follower ranking. So we think that was one discrepancy. And then PwC is another interesting one to point out. They received a pretty high LinkedIn ranking based on our scoring, but the follower ranking was #13, which was quite a bit lower. And we think that's because they're just such a big company that follower to employee ratio might have gone against them a bit. It's hard to acquire so many followers based on their size, so that might be a bit of a discrepancy as well. But I would say overall, if you look at these numbers, it does match up quite a bit. The more robust of a LinkedIn presence you have, the higher the followers. Okay, but now that I've talked about the dimensions and I've talked about how does it impact audience engagement, I want to get to one of the most interesting questions, which is which of these 4 dimensions actually makes the biggest impact in terms of acquiring followers. So I want you all to think back to what you guessed was the most important dimension here, and I'm going to tell you the answer. So we, for this, didn't do that loose ranking and showing how it aligns. Instead, here we did more of a mathematical assessment. And we actually found a statistically significant correlation for both legal and consulting. We found that company profile robustness was correlated to the follower-to-employee ratio. And then for consulting, we actually found that the leadership profile robustness correlated to the follower-to-employee ratio. And these p-values that I'm showing here mean that there's a less than 5% chance that this correlation is a fluke. So we're pretty confident that these numbers are in fact legit and that these are very important elements to keep in mind for both these industries. So some observations and questions we had here. The frequency of content posting did not surface as a big differentiator. So for those of you who picked posts as what you thought would be make the biggest difference, you might be a bit surprised why that didn't show up as a significant correlation. And we think that that's because overall the playing field for that is pretty even. A lot of the firms are posting regularly. If we had taken some kind of mathematical assessment or scoring based on the types of posts, we may have found that in fact made a bigger difference. But we were only looking at frequency in terms of our scoring. Also, we noticed that currently company profile pages make the biggest impact for law firms, but we wondered if in a few years, once their presence on LinkedIn is a bit more mature, if perhaps the leadership profiles would become more impactful, as is the case for consulting firms. And then finally, we really thought that it made sense that the leadership profiles are so impactful for consulting firms. And we think that it's because people tend to be curious about other people. We also think that we like to network, and we're far more interested in content that comes recommended by an individual than by a company. Okay, so now that I've talked to you about all of the results from our assessment, I'm going to leave you with some parting thoughts. First of all, as you can see, overall consulting firms did win this battle, but I wanted to say that it's really not a battle, and that's because consulting and legal industries are different. So we can't really compare the two exactly. We do expect that there are going to be differences in their LinkedIn behavior because they are different industries. But that doesn't mean that law firms can't learn from what consulting firms are doing. The other thing that we wanted to point out is that what your people do matters. We thought this was a really important finding, that the most impactful LinkedIn features for consulting firms were the leadership profiles. And if law firms were to boost their profiles, we think that they may see some similar results as consulting firms. And then finally, LinkedIn presence is no longer a nice to have. So as we saw in a lot of those heat maps that I was showing you, there are big disparities between firms that have a robust LinkedIn presence and those that may be lower across some of these dimensions. So we actually think this shows that there's a lot of opportunity to not just be on LinkedIn, but to be doing more on LinkedIn and close some of those gaps. And then in terms of what you should do coming out of this, and based on what we learned today, I have a checklist for you that you can use and take away with you. So first of all, a big takeaway is that it's important to stay updated. LinkedIn is always changing. There's always new features that are available out there, and it's important for you to be checking regularly and seeing if there's some new feature that you could be taking advantage of. Also, it's important to prioritize your company profile page. That's a basic, and as you saw, it makes a big difference in the law industry especially. So create a strong company page and look at your careers page as well, because that's also important. Thirdly, definitely urge your employees to complete their profiles on LinkedIn. to form connections and to engage audiences with interesting posts and publications, because now that's available to them. Also, ensure that your company is not just posting firm-centric content, but also content that audiences can really use, and give them a reason to be checking the updates regularly. Also, explore utilizing groups. We think that particularly for alumni, because they can become future clients and also refer others, that's a great place to start, is to form groups for alumni. And then finally, track your engagement on LinkedIn. We did our best with looking at the follower numbers, but if we had access to all the other robust analytics that LinkedIn already provides, we could have really been able to dive even deeper. So that's all available to each company on LinkedIn, and that's something that you could be tracking regularly to see if what you're doing is making a difference. Okay, and with that, I want to thank you all so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I'm going to hand it over to Kayla for that.
I'm going to start going through the questions. Our first one is, when measuring followers seems like a good way to monitor engagement, but did you consider looking at other indicators such as whether or not people are commenting or liking posts?
All right, and that's a great question. And as I had mentioned, we did look at the followers, but another publicly available piece of data that we were considering looking at is if you go onto company pages, you can actually see when they make posts. Oftentimes you can see a lot of interesting data, such as how many people liked it, how many people commented on posts. We started to collect some of that information, but it just got a bit unwieldy, as you can imagine. And there's a lot of variation between what engagement one post gets versus another made by a company. So we do think that that's something that is very interesting to look at, but it's not something that we chose to use as our main form of measuring engagement. We thought followers was far more consistent and also just easier for our assessment to get that information. That's a great question, though.
All right, the next question is, what was the most surprising thing you discovered while doing this research?
Yeah, that's also a great question. What was interesting for us as we were going through a lot of these leadership profiles actually was we were pretty surprised when we found individuals who didn't even have a picture uploaded. And we just thought that this was a really big miss. And that's because there are some statistics that show that if you upload a picture to your profile, it's actually 11 times more likely that people will click and look at your profile. So just very surprising that we're sure that a lot of these leaders actually have pictures that they could have uploaded but just chose not to, and we thought that was a bit of a miss.
We have a question regarding individual attorney profiles. If an attorney is promoted internally from an associate to a partner and they make this change on their LinkedIn profile, LinkedIn will then broadcast the change to the attorney's contacts as a job change. There is some thought that this is a negative, since technically the attorney has not changed firms or gotten a new job. What are your thoughts as to whether this type of profile change is okay to be pushed to the newsfeed versus whether a new role or internal promotion activity update should be disabled if an attorney changes roles within the firm?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I wouldn't say there's definitely a right or wrong answer to it. I just think it's interesting to call out that with LinkedIn, there's always some kind of risks like this, that you're maybe showing too much information about your employees. For example, like headhunters can more easily find people, or they can see when roles have changed. And my answer to that overall is that we just think that the benefit of having these people on LinkedIn, connecting with people, posting interesting content, it outweighs a lot of those risks that you might be really concerned that people see this information or might think the wrong thing. We think that there's a lot of benefit in just making sure that you have the latest up-to-date information on LinkedIn, and that's really what's most important, that the benefit outweighs the risk here.
Next question. I noticed that you didn't mention LinkedIn showcase pages. Curious if you looked into this and who wins the battle between law firms and consulting firms?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I would say we did look at what we called auxiliary pages. So that's when we saw some additional pages created by firms, and we just decided to denotate whether or not they were using that type of feature. I think they seem to have different names, and there's always new features that are coming out there. We did this assessment in the summer, so I'm not sure the same terminology was used back then, but that's something that we can definitely continue to look into going forward and staying on top of what these latest features are.
Next question, how do you encourage people to update their profiles at your company? That's a traditional hurdle.
Yeah, that is a big hurdle, and the advice that I would offer is I think people respond really well to data, and I think that that's the benefit of this assessment that we did is that we actually found some concrete numbers that show that leadership profiles are important in generating more followers. So I think if you make the case to the people at your firm that this really does matter and show them why, that would make a much stronger case for them to invest time and actually build up their presence on LinkedIn, because it could definitely draw in more clients.
Okay, next question. What can you suggest for leadership to boost their profiles? Is it reposting content, engaging audience, and connecting with more contacts? What about endorsements?
Those are good questions, and once again, I don't have a clear answer for that because we don't have really numeric data that shows what specific activity on with your profile makes the biggest difference on that level. But just based on my own personal taste with profiles, I tend to not think endorsements are quite as valuable as some of the other things, which are you making connections? I think that's very important. And are you sharing interesting content that you're creating? And I think the fact that publications, that you can now post publications to your profile is really important, because that can really help credentialize you on LinkedIn. And then naturally commenting on posts and sharing them to show that you really know what's happening in your field. Those are all the most important things when it comes to your profile.
Our next question, are you looking to compare any other industries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we learned a lot from looking at law firms and consulting firms, and potentially in the future, we may choose to look at other industries as well, because it would be interesting to see, law firms and consulting firms we think are different, but they have a lot of similarities in that they tend to share a lot of thought leadership content, they're relationship-based businesses, but it would be interesting to maybe compare them to a different type of industry and just see what those differences are.
Awesome. Well, that wraps up the Q&A session. If we weren't able to get to your question, we'll be following up with you after the webinar. Also, if you have additional questions or are interested in learning more about Alex's research, feel free to reach out to Alex or the marketing team here. Our email address is marketing@onenorth.com. And you can see Alex's email on the slide. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye. Thank you.